I was wondering if you could like start out by talking a bit more about like how you personally identify and like what communities you'd say you're part of.
That's a good question. And the answer is all of them and none of them at the same time of the list I'm about to go into. Like at this point, once we like get further into the interview, it always happens. But like, so if we are talking about like integrated identity wise, like stuff that I have an ongoing relationship with and I navigate stuff with, I would say I'm South Asian, I'm diaspora, I'm a kid of immigrants, um, queer, trans, non-binary, um, Muslim, neurodivergent. If we want to like drill down into the neurodivergent, that we have mental health disabilities, we have autism and ADHD and PTSD and all of like the various things that accompany that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we've got like the mental health and the cognitive disability piece. We've got the physical health piece, which is stuff like EDS and all of its billion and one cousins of correlated conditions, and a lot of the in between there. So I usually just broadly identify myself as chronically ill and disabled because it's easier than just kind of drilling down into the like, depending on who you talk to, like anywhere from like 7 to 15 disabilities that are on the table there. In addition to that, I would say I am in recovery from an eating disorder, just ongoing for the rest of my life. I am a survivor of abuse. I'm a survivor of like kind of various traumas, and I'm a storyteller and an artist and a community organizer. So just kind of all of the things wrapped up into one, just a tiny ball of anger. Like
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Goodness. And the other thing too is that like when I have this conversation, inevitably I kind of sit there and I go, I'm a part of all of these communities. Some of them want me sometimes. Oh goodness. Because like I feel like there's kind of this dynamic where like simultaneously like, and this can be both a good and a bad thing, like when you're part of a whole bunch of communities, it's really normal to kind of go in and out of like which one of them you highlight when talking about a given issue or a given thing. And like I don't think that's inherently bad. What I do think has is kind of also a factor of that is less good is that frequently organizations and like community organizing and community groups will sometimes kind of do the same thing, and along the way sometimes might drop or forget other identity groups that are inherently intersecting with theirs. And
Mm.
kind of the butt end of that a whole bunch since I've come up to DC. For reference here, I usually get into this as like a part of a conversation because it's hard to say this in a way that's like clear and obvious in say publication format because it requires more than a sentence of explanation. But so I grew up originally in North Texas, so relatively small town, pretty close to Dallas, like 45 minutes away. Town started out like kind of a rural suburb and rapidly urbanized, and now is like kind of weirdly a conservative suburb, but with just enough of a tech sector to draw a lot of immigrants that are slowly pushing it purpler than it otherwise would be. But at the time I was growing up, still like smaller town and smaller town cultural norms. And so like I grew up kind of surrounded by those cultural norms. And then when I ended up going to college, like I was really thoroughly shaped by like what I tend to shorthand as like Southern queer organizing norms. So particularly Southern trans organizing norms around like just kind of resource giving and community. Because like in full transparency with you, I've talked about this, I think a handful of times before, but like I almost didn't go to college because like amongst the giant list of identities was survival of like abuse. One of the things was that um, my parents subtly but intentionally filled out the FAFSA incorrectly in order to prevent them from actually providing their adequate financial information, which meant that I couldn't get any need-based aid, which meant need plus merit-based aid was also off the table. So I ended up going to a local college because UT Dallas, which was the one closest to me, had a process where I could essentially plead my case directly in person to someone. And they were like, yeah, no, this isn't the first time we've heard of something like this happening. Here, do you have any source of income of your own? And I was like, I have a horrible job at Payless. And they were like, okay, cool, that makes less than $10,000 a year. So you're legally under or the minimum amount necessary for us to cover your tuition. We can't cover your housing because your residential address is within a certain area, but we can cover your tuition. We can cover the fees associated with things like getting you textbooks. But if you want to live on campus and if you need to get here by in some form or fashion other than you driving yourself, which I didn't have a license, you will need to figure that out yourself. The only way I was able to do that is that so one of my direct friends, my best friend at the time, God bless her, very tiny, very sweet, deeply conservative Catholic girl who was deeply, deeply out of her range. She did not really understand LGBT issues, but she understood that I was sad and lonely because of the gay thing. And she was like, okay, so you're telling me that you are feeling really depressed because you don't know any gays. And like, I mean, I know one, but they actively dislike me. So effectively, yes. And she was just like, is a bi like a gay? And I was like, yes, Lindsay, a bi is like a gay. And she was like, your sister is dating a bi. Here are their phone number. Can you like talk to them and maybe like express how you're feeling about everything and like they can help you? And I was like, okay, I don't know them. And they were like, it'll be fine. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna tell them to text you. Okay. And luckily we did actually get along and became very close friends. And by some godforsaken miracle, they were already enrolled at UT Dallas, and their house was close enough to mine that they picked me up and drove me to and from school, and I planned my classes around their schedule. And that was the only way I could go to school because I couldn't drive. I could drive, but I didn't have a license because PTSD-based things from my dad screaming at me meant that I hadn't actually passed the driver's test. So anyways, point being, like every aspect of me kind of transitioning to adulthood, like that whole period of time was shaped by that sort of thing. Like very much this sense of like, if I don't help you, nobody else is going to. And temerity, like this sense of like Southern queers and Southern trans people especially have to take care of each other because the structures barely exist otherwise. And frequently what does exist is bad enough quality that it's actively dangerous. And like, I grew into that really, really rapidly. Like my freshman year, I ended up being an officer in Rainbow Guard, which was our policy advocacy thing on campus. It was a really new group, like literally had started first semester, and by second semester, I'd gotten on as an officer to do like policy writing. And really rapidly, it became clear that like we were what we had. Like if someone say a mental health crisis and would try and go to the school to talk about it, for example, let's say, like hopefully, obviously this wouldn't happen, but it did in some cases. If someone came with a suicidality issue and they were concerned for their own physical safety in like this short immediate term, the school didn't have the resources to say put them in a peer resource type of center where it's not effectively a prison. So what they did have was Greenhaven, which was a nearby psych rehab hospital, which had a psych ward, and they would have the police take you in handcuffs, plop you down there, sit you there for about 2 days, and then take you back. And that was if you were lucky, because like they didn't feed you, and they didn't have showers, and they didn't have private beds. Like just straight up, it was essentially just like a large box.
Oh my God.
There. like theoretically they had food available that they were supposed to take you to twice a day because it's a hospital. In practice, most of us did not get food while we were there because what they had to offer did not have allergen in associations. And if, say, you have a peanut allergy, you really don't want to be in a psych ward and also having an allergic reaction.
Yeah.
So like, if so, like that was the state we were in. Like, where if someone had an immediate crisis, we couldn't trust the school to do what they needed to make sure that person was safe. So we did it ourselves. We ended up having just kind of this set rotation of people where if someone was in danger, or frequently, we'd end up taking them in and keeping them on our couches. It's like for those of us who lived on campus or near campus, and they would stay with us for usually a night or two at a time. If it ended up longer than that, we just had a rotation that they would settle through and they'd go couch to couch until they were at a point where they felt stable enough that they could take care of themselves on their own, or that they could get by with just someone in the group coming by to check in on them every day for a bit. And there was a lot of stuff like that, stuff around like food, stuff around accessibility, just like there was very much the sense that like you can try the school and we're trying to fix the school. And in a lot of cases, the school did get better by the time we left it, but we didn't have the sense that anyone else was going to look out for us. So we had to do it. Like, it didn't matter if we were qualified or not. It mattered that we had to learn how to take care of each other. And just that, yeah, that sense is what I grew up with during like my transitional period into adulthood. So that, like, I have that stuck in my head as how community models work, that like, if it doesn't exist, you build it, because if you don't build it, it's never going to happen. And like, in some cases that worked really well. Like when I was still living in North Texas, there was very much a culture of like, oh, you want queer Muslim things to exist here, but there aren't any? Okay, you're part of a student group on campus. Here, have them rent a room, hold a discussion series about queer Muslims, and just do it for like 2 months and see what happens. And we did, and it turned out that there were like 5 or 6 queer Muslims on campus that liked having like the ability to regularly meet and talk to each other. And in some cases it didn't work out, and there weren't like ongoing groups during the time that we had those things set up. But the groundwork that we had and the documentation that we made from doing those things, because they were saved up and used by the next generation of activists, we now things on that campus, like say our queer BIPOC group, which is entirely by and for queer people of color on campus. And like, I'm not a fan of the fraternity sorority structure, but there is a dieternity, so a gender neutral fraternity sorority on campus now, whose entire purpose is to do drag shows and donate all the money that they make to a local food source in Dallas that feeds homeless trans youth. So like, it's a cycle. Like, the thought process that I've got is like, you build the thing. If it works, great. If you don't, you document it and you make sure people can find it. Here, it was a whole different world.